Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Rocket Summer, a BookTube event created by Michael K. Vaughan, of course, to deal with classic science fiction. So everything from Wells and Verne and company all the way to 1970, when all the norms of science fiction and of society went out the window. So 1970 is our cutoff. All the great science fiction novels that have come after that will be for some other event, probably one created by Michael K. Vaughan. I'm surprised he hasn't done that. I'm surprised he hasn't done a pulp event, but they're all, the future is unwritten. So Rocket Summer has a structure. It has a structure. Week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, taking different decades, slowly and statefully progressing towards the 1960s, which is an explosion of science fiction. An explosion of things to read, of interesting departures, so that you knew that something big was coming in the 1970s. And also that science fiction would, by the 1960s and 1970s, be wearing out the reputation that it got from the pulps of being mongrel fiction that is no serious interest. Now suddenly it would start to be in hardcover. It would suddenly start to be on the New York Times bestseller list. Maybe even, again, Brooks would disagree, but maybe even close to this, it would start to be taught in schools as a serious kind of literature. But I'm not doing that. That is the progression that Book Trek is supposed to take, but I've not been doing that. Instead, I've been bouncing all around, usually being drawn not to the obscure future men, Edmund Hamilton type 35-cent pulp crapola that I assembled for this event, but instead to well-known books that I've been loving it, because most of these well-known books, you know how it goes with mystery, or I would argue especially science fiction, where you read a science fiction book in your early 20s and you think, okay, and then for the next decade or 2 decades or 3 decades or 4 or even 5 decades, when you think about that book, you're thinking about the reaction you had when you read it in your early 20s. You can't give that reaction to a book. I know we all do, but you can't do that. So this has been incredibly refreshing to go back to all of these books. And I did that again last night. I think I'm just going to do this for the rest of Rocket Summer. I'll do apologies to all those crappy old 35-cent mass market paperbacks. I'll get to them in due time. Science fiction is not like, for instance, another MKV event is June on the Range, where we read Westerns. And Westerns as a genre is something that appeals to me in an average amount, so that I'm perfectly happy sequestering all of my Western reading to June. Science fiction is not like that. I read science fiction all year round. I reread it all year long. So I will get to those books. But last night I went to a biggie. I went to another biggie. I think I'll do this for the rest of Rocket Summer, especially since the rest of you don't seem to mind, and my fellow co-hosts for Rocket Summer have not booted me off the ticket. So I guess this is partially acceptable. Last night I read I, Robot by Isaac Asimov, the one, the only Isaac Asimov. Now, I think I am probably alone on all of BookTube for thinking that the Will Smith movie called I Am Robot is totally kick-ass. I absolutely love it. It doesn't have anything to do with this book, except that it takes place in a future world in which robots are ubiquitous, in which they are no more thought of than cars are today. It's not like you see a robot in a 1950s serial that you would go to a drive-in for, and the robot is an object of awe and horror. It's not like Gort in The Day the Earth Stood Still. They're everywhere. And the Will Smith movie starts off that way. It also has a wonderful ending and a couple of great scenes in it. I know that my judgment in movies is the source of a great deal of hard ribbing in our little corner of BookTube. That's okay. Time will prove me right and all of you wrong about the Mark Wahlberg Planet of the Apes. But in the meantime, I thought the Will Smith I, Robot movie was quite entertaining, quite good. But that's not this. This is actually 8 or 9 short stories that are just collected. There's an attempt, a very thin attempt on Asimov's part to make them into a novel in sequence, short stories that sequence into a novel, this was done 70 years ago, but now sequenced short stories confected into a novel is all the rage. all the cokeheads from Yaddo do that. They love doing that because they don't have the attention span to write a novel that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, Isaac Asimov wasn't like that. He did have that attention span and could write a novel with a beginning, a middle, and an end in about an hour. But here, it's short stories, including Robbie the Robot, which won't mean anything to young readers now, but once upon a time, that was synonymous. Once upon a time, the word robot and the word Robbie were synonymous. And this introduces that world. It introduces the robotologist, Susan Calvin. It introduces the idea of robots as a ho-hum quotidian invention. Something that has been perfected and is now a part of society. Robot nannies, robot teachers, robot everything. And that might seem like nothing, right? Because science fiction, comic books, and movies, even later novels, every later novel has that as just a given. But that was very interesting. I won't say shocking, but it was it was arresting when this first came out. When this Fawcett paperback, I found this on a spinner rack in a drugstore a long, long time ago. Longer than you would probably believe. I found and read this enchantedly. I read it during a hot summer. I read it with dogs during a hot summer. And I found the idea, well, imagine that, a world where robots are everywhere, where they do the grunt work, where they are not a thing of amazement. Imagine that. Imagine how that would be. And I entered that world again when I reread this book. Of course, the most famous aspect of this book is the 3 laws of robotics. Because these robots are governed. The whole point, another distant echo of the Will Smith movie, is what happens if a robot is not governed by the 3 laws of robotics. What happens if many of them aren't governed by that? What if they change their own programming so they're no longer governed by the 3 laws of robotics? I think that is handled well in the Will Smith movie, and time will vindicate me. But in the meantime, if you don't believe me, watch it. Just get it on streaming, put it on that giant plasma screen TV of yours, and watch it. See if you aren't entertained. Anyway, we're not here to talk about the Will Smith iRobot. For those of you who have never read this, maybe you're not familiar with Isaac Asimov, the 3 laws of robotics, basically, I don't know them by heart anymore. I used to know the exact wording, as every science fiction fan used to do. But they boil down to, law number 1 is, a robot may not harm a human or by inaction allow a human to come to harm. Rule number 2 is that a robot may not harm another robot unless doing so, or failing to do so, violates rule number 1. In other words, if you're a robot and you see a robot attacking a human, you are supposed to attack that robot, because rule number 1 applies. You are not to allow a human to come to harm by any means. And rule number 3 is that a robot is allowed to protect itself, provided that rule number 3, the observing of rule number 3, does not violate rule number 2 or rule number 1. And I remember reading those and thinking, that's really neat. And it wasn't until, I don't know, a good 10 years later. It was a good 10 years after I read this book before I met another human being who liked to read for pleasure. So it was a good long time after I read this that I realized that right from the beginning, those 3 laws of robotics were causing a certain kind of reader with a certain kind of mind to go nuts trying to come up with loopholes, with ways around that. Now, Isaac Asimov was pretty darn good at anticipating those kinds of loopholes. He was pretty darn good at that. And I don't believe that any of the loopholes that I've ever seen hold water. The normal violation of the 3 laws of robotics is that a human violates them, creates a robot that doesn't have them. But there are all sorts of, oh my God, there are whole treaties about people hair-splitting about how you could get around these laws to make unsafe robots. That's the whole point of the laws of robotics, is that Asimov wanted to imagine a world in which, if your robots are going to be teachers for your little children, nannies, if they're going to be doing your errands, if they're going to be out in society on the sidewalks and on buses, they absolutely have to be safe. In a way, I might add here, just as an aside, that the robots that are constantly featured in MIT ads for their latest war machine monstrosities are not programmed. The dog-shaped robots, the human-shaped robots that do all sorts of fun stuff in the mall as a demonstration are not programmed with the 3 laws of robotics at all. I never understand why people can look at film footage of stuff like that and do what they always do, which is say, that is so neat, when it's the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. But anyway, I reread these stories. last night, and I love them, just love them. And I realized all over again two things when I was rereading this book. This is a perfect example of what Rocket Summer has been for me. I would never in a million years have thought to go back to iRobot. I would have assumed that I had an opinion on it. But it's high time I went back to it, and I did, and I came up with two things that I noticed most of all. One is that although these are relatively standalone short stories, they're really good. They're really well thought out. And two, two is something that I actually had the privilege of being able to say to the author face to face, which is that, God, I love this guy on the page. I just love Isaac Asimov on the page. It's not great. It's not great. It's not. I mean, if we're going to talk about other figures at this time period, if you're going to talk about, or Asimov's career, of course, spanned lots of decades. If you're going to talk about Thomas Dish, or Joanna Russ, or Verna Vinge, it's not great. It is essentially Michael K. Vaughan's beloved pulp writing raised to an art form, so that it doesn't have the pulpiness anymore. It's not bad, but it still wants only, first, foremost, and everywhere to entertain you. Whether that's by making you think, or by coming up with some weird idea that's tossed off in one paragraph and never revisited, or dreaming up a whole world. It mainly, exclusively wants to entertain you. And I used to frequent a particular back room of a particular used bookstore here in Boston, and I mentioned to the author, who had a very rude layover, and nothing better to do, and no better company to do it in, as he put it himself. Nothing better to do, and no better company to do it in. It was a bunch of writers in that back room, and I was there. I wasn't a writer, but I was there. I was invited to be there, and I told him, I know it's that in this conversation, especially with these names being dropped and some of these names being in the room, this is going to seem like an insult, but I just love reading your books. I just love it. They put a smile on my face even when the events you're describing are tragic or dramatic. And he was pleased with that. And I believe that did please him. I believe that's why he wrote. Boy, oh boy, rereading this book, I wanted so bad to still have the big fat volumes of his autobiography. I had all those volumes once upon a time. And I got rid of them for one reason or another. Maybe because they're so big. And I found one volume at the Book Barn when I went there with Mark Richardson one time, years ago. And I don't know why I got rid of it. I must have sent it to one of you, but I got rid of it. You never see those out in the wild. And more than anything, I mean, I will read a lot of other Isaac Asimov fiction. In fact, this book really, really whetted my appetite to do that. In a way that back when I was going to Vermont regularly, we were watching Foundation. Our Foundation was on the cable news show, or the cable channel, and Mark had the Barnes and Noble hardcover of the first three Foundation books, and I reread them while I was up there, and loved them even more then. I don't know that I made a video about it, but I loved them even more then than I had the first time I read them at all. And Mark also had that really neat trade paperback that it seemed for a little while that everybody on BookTube had a copy of that thing. But this even more, even though this is less ambitious and I would say less good. This even more made me want to read a lot more Isaac Asimov, which would be so predictable for Rocket Summer. So I don't know that I'll do it for Rocket Summer, but like I said, I'm not confining science fiction reading to July. But iRobot, 2 huge thumbs up. What a book. What a great little book. Oh my. How I wish I had this Fawcett paperback. Still, I'll never see it. These old paperbacks are disappearing from the wild. Or falling, or even worse, falling into the hands of horrible reptilian collectors who will want $20 for this thing. But doesn't matter. I had a blast. I had an absolute blast. So my Rocket Summer is going swimmingly, even though I am breaking the rules. So I'm going to continue to break the rules because these kind of reading experiences, oh my. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.